Hello Dan, hi. Welcome to Government House and to Guernsey on this virtual 75th anniversary of liberation.
It's great to be back on the island virtually, and particularly seeing you, Marco. So thank you for, and you're going to give me a tour around the house, aren't you?
We are, yeah. We've got some interesting things to show you. We're going to attempt to move from the ballroom through to some of the other rooms to look at what life was like here during the occupation.
Well, I was going to say, what did happen there during occupation? Who was in there?
Well, that's an interesting question, Dan, actually, because there was a lot of toing and froing. Before the war, there was a Lieutenant Governor appointed in June of 1939. It was Major General Alexander Telfer Smollett. Now, he was sent to Guernsey with his wife. Sadly, she died while he was in office. I've got a picture of him here. She died while he was in office, and he was recalled by the War Office to go back to England to command a military district. Now, that happened in May of 1940. Now, you can see that it was quite clear what was going to be happening fairly soon, and you'd have thought that that probably would be the last Lieutenant Governor that we see for a while. But no, they saw fit to send another Lieutenant Governor who arrived at the beginning of June 1940. We've got a picture of him here. It's not framed. It probably wasn't here long enough for it to be framed. But this is Major General John Minshall Ford. Now, he arrived here with his wife and daughter at the beginning of June 1940. Very soon after.
This is basically during Dunkirk.
Yes, absolutely. Probably exactly the same time that Dunkirk was happening. He arrived, moved into the house here, and on the 19th of June, a signal was sent from the War Office recalling the Lieutenant Governors of both Jersey and Guernsey immediately. He was in office for about 2 weeks, which we think is probably a record. A Lieutenant Governor normally serves 5 years. So he had, we're told that he had about 3 hours to pack up and vacate the house. And a local contractor would be familiar to some islanders, Messrs Fuzzy, came to pack up his stuff and took it off to their property in Rue de Pré. And then that was it. He was off. He was gone. Which left the acting Lieutenant Governor in charge, who was the bailiff of the day, Sir Victor Carey. I've got a picture of him here. Now, Sir Victor, by this stage, was already 69 years old. This was a lot of responsibility, a lot of pressure on him. So he became not only the bailiff of Guernsey, the civic head and the head of the judiciary and the speaker in the States, he was also the sovereign's representative. And bearing in mind what was about to happen, you can imagine the pressure that was on him. But it was only about 10 days after the Minshall Fords made a hurried exit that the Germans arrived, and the house was occupied again very soon because it was chosen as the official residence of the Inseln Commandant. That was the commandant of all the Channel Islands, who was a Major Albrecht Lance. A relatively junior officer, a major, was commandant of all of the Channel Islands. And you can imagine that this was a nice, big, comfortable house for him to move into with all his staff. So they settled in here and operated from here. But the really interesting thing about it, I think, was the propaganda value of it. And that wouldn't have been lost on Dr. Goebbels, that you had the representative of the Third Reich was living in the, until recently, the residence of the King's personal representative in the Bailiwick.
I mean, astonishing stuff. How long was he in there? And how did the house survive, flourish? Was it well looked after under his and his successors' occupation?
Well, by all accounts, they were very comfortable in the house. That worked well. I think the story of the house is also the story of the occupation. It started off fine, and then things got progressively more difficult, more challenging. Things were in short supply. Lance didn't stay as the commandant of the Channel Islands. He was replaced later on. But no, they seem to spread out and be quite comfortable in here, the occupants. In fact, we can go through, I can take you through to the drawing room and the conservatory and show you some pictures that we've got of them living here.
Let's have a look. Go for it.
So we're now in the drawing room of Government House, and we've got an interesting picture here of German officers relaxing off duty here in the room, which I'll just show you, Dan.
Oh, that's amazing. Is that the same? It hasn't changed much, has it?
No. So that's the room. You see, it's the same mirror, which is quite an achievement, bearing in mind what happened during the occupation. I think it's the same picture frame, and the room is largely the same. And that's quite an achievement because the house suffered during the occupation, as most buildings and infrastructure did. Of course, you see that picture and it looks quite idyllic as far as the Germans are concerned. A lovely existence, this is occupied Britain, it's all going smoothly. But of course, by June 44, the Allies were back in Europe through Operation Overlord, and by May 45 it was over. The islands were liberated, Guernsey and Jersey were liberated on the 9th, Sark was liberated on the 10th, and the whole thing was finished. We've actually got here as well a copy of the surrender document, one of the original surrender documents. I've just got it here, and it's quite interesting when you read it. It's addressed to the then Commandant of the Kanal-Insel, who was Vice Admiral Hofmeier of the Kriegsmarine, a commander of German troops in the Channel Islands. And at the first point, it lays it out quite clearly. This is dated the 8th of May, 1945. I am here to accept only your unconditional surrender. There is no, in capital letters, no question of an armistice. So basically, the dream was over. The dream of occupied Britain was finished.
And what state was Government House when the Brits arrived, the first liberators arrived back in there? Well,
it was quite different from how it is today. I'm told that a lot of the banisters were missing. They'd probably been used for firewood, I imagine. It was quite a hard winter that they'd just been through. There was no bed linen, there was no crockery. It wasn't a place that you could live in straight away. It sort of reflected, like I say, the state of Guernsey and of course the occupation had run. If you look back to the original commander of the Channel Islands, Major Lance as well, he hadn't fared any better. By all accounts, he was a brave and effective officer. He had taken command of the 396th Infantry Regiment and he was leading them on the Eastern Front. And in 1942, while he was leading his troops, he was very badly wounded and he died in a field hospital of his wounds in Smolensk, in what was then the Soviet Union. So the whole thing, comparatively, hadn't lasted very long, and everything ended up really in a sorry state.
What about the first Lieutenant Governor to arrive back in 1945? Who was he and when did he get there?
Well, he was a very interesting man. The next Lieutenant Governor was Lieutenant General Philip Neame. He wasn't knighted at that stage. He arrived in August 45, so there was a break between May and August in 1945 when the bailiff, Sir Victor Carey, was still the sovereign's representative. Neame, interesting man, born in 1888. He was commissioned into the Royal Engineers. He won a VC in the First World War very early on at the First Battle of Ypres. And it was in recognition of his single-handed defence. He held back the enemy for 45 minutes using improvised hand grenades, which he'd fashioned out of empty jam tins, which he stuffed with pieces of metal. And that was a design that he developed himself while the troops were waiting for delivery of normal hand grenades from the War Department. So he held back the enemy long enough to then personally evacuate the wounded who were able to be moved. So a very heroic act. He then, between the wars, he went on to be part of the British Olympic squad. In the Paris Olympics 1924, he earned a gold medal in a shooting discipline. He then got himself posted to India, apparently in search of adventure, which he certainly found. He was part of the British mission to Lhasa in between the wars, where he trekked there from India to Tibet. At this time, Tibet was closed off to the rest of the world, so that must have been a fascinating experience. And there's an account of that in Freddie Spencer Chapman's book, Memoirs of a Mountaineer. A very interesting journey. He then, back in India, he was very keen on big game hunting apparently, but it didn't always go that well, and he managed to get himself quite severely mauled by a tiger. And while he was in hospital awaiting treatment, two nurses, he was a dashing young brigadier by this stage, two nurses tossed a coin to see who would nurse him. And it was quite fateful because the nurse who won was a nurse called Harriet Alberta Drew, known as Berta. And in tossing the coin and winning, the die was cast and she became Lady Neame and came to live in this house as his wife. So he had an interesting Second World War as well. He became the Commander-in-Chief in Cyrenaica, in what is northeastern Libya now. He was Commander-in-Chief there, and that fell to Rommel in 41. So like everybody else there in the British military, he became a prisoner of war. He was imprisoned in Italy. While he was there, he found time to write his memoirs, Playing with Strife, a very interesting book. He also assisted in many prisoner of war escapes. He helped to organise those before escaping himself in 1943. So an action-packed Second World War. And then we see him appearing in Guernsey in August 1945. He arrived here with his wife, Lady Neame, their 2 children, a son and a daughter, and a governess. But when they arrived in the house, it wasn't fit for them to move into. Some of the ceilings were cracked, and one of them apparently was almost falling down. So they moved into a cottage which was loaned to them, Sir Philip and Lady Neame, and the children and the governess moved into a hotel until the house could be made habitable.
And so he was. How long did that take to repair Government House back to its former glory?
We don't have a record of it, but from what I've read, it was a few months to get it up to shape again. And we actually were looking in the archive over here recently for something else, some other documents, and came across a lot of receipts, very interesting, for the shopping list that they had there when they're going out and rebuying all the glasses, the tableware and things like that, so that they could start entertaining again. But he was a man of action. He didn't hang around. He within 3 hours of being in Guernsey, he was hosting a reception and a tea party, and getting to know the local people and getting underway.
So it sounds like Neame put up with quite a lot when he moved in. It was in a barren state.
It was, but we're told that he took it with good grace. I mean, he was a soldier with a lot of experience. Not so General Minshall Ford, his predecessor. Apparently, after the war, he attempted to recover his possessions. You remember Fuzzies had moved them out and put them in their store in Rue de Pré. And it transpired that the Germans had looted the furniture, including 2 valuable paintings, and the clothing had also disappeared. Now, clothing obviously was in very, very short supply during the occupation, and the States had requisitioned it, and all of his wife's clothing and his daughter's clothing had disappeared. And he wasn't pleased and complained quite forcefully.
I mean, get your priorities straight, man. Right, so what sort of things did General Neame, this decorated war hero, this Olympian, he sounds like a man of action, what did he have to contend with when he got there to Guernsey?
Well, even for him, he had a lot on his plate. But the first thing to say is he wasn't alone. I remember that the bailiff had been left to hold the fort as the Queen's representative and the leader of the island. By this stage, Sir Victor Carey was 74 years old. The strain was really showing. So a new bailiff was appointed, and it was a gentleman called Ambrose Chervil. I've got a picture of him here in a group shot. This is him here. Now, Ambrose Chervil was an interesting man as well. He was a First World War veteran. He was decorated. He had a military cross. He had been Her Majesty's Procurer, which is the Attorney General in Guernsey before the war. He had been appointed as head of the Controlling Committee, which was effectively the emergency government during occupation. Now, we're told that he struck up quite a good working relationship with Major Lance. They both felt that they had sort of similar standards. They both tried to do things according to rules and do them decently. And apparently they worked together quite effectively given the circumstances. But all that changed when the first British Commando landings happened. Those took place on the south coast of Guernsey early on. And basically Guernseymen who were serving in the army were turned around and sent back to Guernsey. People like Hubert Nicol, Philip Martel, Desmond Mulholland. They were landed on the south coast by submarine, and they came ashore. Now that happened a few times, and in the end it was impossible to pick them up, and they were left here, which was a very difficult position. And if they had surrendered in civilian clothes, they arrived in civilian clothes, they would have been treated as spies and shot. So there was an effort amongst the locals to find uniforms for them to surrender in so that they'd be treated as prisoners of war. And various accounts say that there was either Royal Guernsey Militia uniforms or Elizabeth College CCF uniforms. So they surrendered. Now the problem started when the procurer and the head of the controlling committee, Ambrose Chervil, was implicated in it. It was found that he knew about it and he helped organise these uniforms for them. So immediately the trust was broken. He was deported to France and he ended up in the notorious, the infamous Cherche Midi prison in Paris as a prisoner of the Gestapo. He was in a very small cell, 10 by 5, and spent some time there. But in the strange way that things happened in the occupation, there was a change of heart. Major Lance managed to convince his superiors that it actually would be better for local morale and cohesion if Ambrose Chervil was brought back. So he came back to Guernsey, was reinstated in his appointment, but then he was deported again later in the war and disappeared. So by this stage in 45, he was coming back for the second time to Guernsey. He was appointed as bailiff at the relatively young age of 55. But a good leader. So the combination of Ambrose Chervil and General Sir Philip Neame together proved to be a particularly effective partnership, and it was quite fortuitous for the island that it had these two people in charge.
It sounds like two really remarkable characters at the helm. What were the? I mean, tell me, what paint a picture of the islands on VE Day? What were their challenges?
Enormous. What faced them was quite overwhelming. There were 76,000 mines in the ground, 13,000 prisoners of war, of which they retained 1,500 to carry out works. There was the detritus of war was everywhere. There were broken vehicles. There was barbed wire entanglements everywhere. All the farmland was overgrown. There were obstacles all over the place. The shore was inaccessible. So much to sort out. Half the population was away. They were trying to bring home half the population. They had the evacuees all over mainland Britain. They had deportees in Germany and Laufen and Biberach, some still in France. But there were also a lot of islanders who had enlisted and fought through the Second World War, and they had to be demobbed and brought home to help the effort to get the island back on its feet. My grandfather was one of those. My mother was born in England while he was serving there. So this massive, complex load of moving parts to try and coordinate to get the island going. And of course, the real problem at the time, one of their real priorities was the economy. Guernsey's economy had then, at that time, 3 pillars. The first one, horticulture, which people are probably familiar with, that wasn't working. The greenhouses were in a poor state of repair. There was no materials to repair them, and there was no oil to heat them. So the tomatoes and the grapes couldn't be grown. Agriculture had ground to a halt. The land was overgrown. It was infested with weeds because there was no freedom of movement. There was barbed wire everywhere. So that had to be cleared. There was no fertiliser to put in the ground to get the land productive again. And the third one, of course, was tourism. There was no tourist boat, no mail boat to bring people over, and even if they had managed to get here somehow, there was nowhere for them to stay. So the engine of the island's economy was completely stalled, so they had to get that started at the same time as well. So a really big task.
And presumably there was a shortage of money.
Yes, yeah. The financial situation was dire. Guernsey had a debt of £7 million at the time. Now in today's money, that's about 270 million. Now out of that 7 million, 4 million was owed to the banks. So yeah, a real shortage of money.
Was Neame central in trying to rebuild the islands, or was there a lot of help from the British government, for example?
I think what Neame provided, along with Chervil, was leadership, which was essential. But there were a lot of players involved in getting this thing going. Neame provided and Chervil provided sort of clear direction. What Neame did is he worked a lot behind the scenes. He worked sort of in a diplomatic capacity with the British government. He did a lot of work to try and get them some financial assistance. One thing he did was to get the British government to write off the £1 million that Guernsey owed for the evacuation, as well as some of the money for the cost of the evacuees when they were in in mainland Britain. Of course, none of this was free. They were all housed, they were all fed, they were all schooled. There were ships that took them over there. That came with a bill. So he worked hard to minimise that. He was also worked very closely with his opposite number. He had a good rapport with his opposite number in Jersey, Lieutenant General Sir Arthur Grasset. And they, any sort of inter-island rivalry was shelved, and they worked closely together. And the two of them held regular inter-island meetings, also involving Alderney as well, to try and get this thing going. So he was providing leadership, he was providing direction, he was allocating assets, working with Chervil, and keeping a real focus.
Inter-island rivalry, Marco. I don't know what you're talking about there. I've never come across that in the Channel Islands in my life. Talk to me about, you mentioned Alderney there. Let's talk a little bit about the other islands in the islands of Guernsey, because there would have been, I mentioned, huge challenges on Alderney, weren't there?
Enormous, yeah. All of the islands, all of the Channel Islands had a different occupation experience, and certainly within the Bailiwick, Guernsey, Sark and Alderney, theirs were quite different. Now, Alderney had fared quite differently. It was completely evacuated. It was depopulated. Judge French, who was leading at the time, encouraged all of the islanders to leave. And so the island was left to the mercy of the enemy. And they wreaked absolute havoc on it. And we've got an original map here in Government House, which was plotted from reconnaissance. It's all the defences in Alderney, and it's absolutely covered in mines along the coast. It's completely covered in barbed wire. There are hutted encampments, which we now know were prison camps, some of which became concentration camps.
It's a beautiful map. That it's extraordinary, isn't it?
Yes, it's absolutely fascinating. Yeah, really interesting. Alderney was uninhabitable. So for that reason, Alderney wasn't liberated in the same way. There was nobody there, but it took from May until December the 15th, which is Alderney's homecoming day, which the islanders there celebrate, to get Alderney inhabitable again. And one of the accounts, a very good book called The Alderney Story, it talks about Neame becoming obsessed with Alderney. It became a really big focus of his. And he used to travel up there a lot. Apparently he had a speedboat. He used to go up there himself, and he was constantly up there trying to sort things out. He insisted that the islanders came home to a proper military welcoming parade. There was no military band there. There had been one in Guernsey, an army band, but it had just been sent back to the mainland. So the only band in Alderney at the time was the German dance band, which obviously people decided probably wasn't suitable to play the national anthem for when they stepped ashore. So Neame arranged for the Guernsey Salvation Army Band to be shipped up there, and they were a bit hesitant about it because the weather's changeable and they didn't want to get stuck up there and miss Sunday when they were supposed to be back in church playing. So they dutifully went up there for December the 15th. The weather wasn't very good. They played, and yes, they got stuck in Alderney. So it was... the accounts you read of it, it was quite a sobering homecoming for them when the Rydunians, as it's called, the residents of Alderney, when they stepped off the boat. It was quite a shock. So much work. So much work to do.
Sorry. Yeah, I talked to several of them that remember the state of that landscape was extraordinary.
Yeah, infested with rats. Apparently there's an account of one man who managed to fill a sack with 150 dead rats in one day. They were everywhere. A lady who played the organ in St Anne's Church went in to play it. It wasn't working, the pedals weren't working, and a rat ran out of it. Apparently everything was infested with fleas. Terrible. They kept a lot of prisoners of war there, and Neame actually warned the islanders not to get too friendly with them, and he reminded them these are the people who wrecked your island, so don't get too close to them. But this is one of those human stories in war. The prisoners of war were very happy to help. A lot of them were artisans, they were craftsmen, so they helped repair the houses. Some of the houses had no roofs. There were houses in terrible state, one without a staircase. One family who owned two houses came back to find one had completely disappeared. It had gone. So the prisoners of war helped out, and they started to build quite a rapport with the islanders. In fact, the last boat of prisoners of war to leave the island, apparently they put on a music concert on the last night, which everyone went along to, and they had a sing-song. It must have been quite an atmosphere up there. But it was a desperate situation, and it's the only time when Britain has attempted collectivisation or communism, effectively. Collective economy was enforced, and everyone had to work for a set wage, working, and it was, to all intents and purposes, communism. But as you can imagine, it didn't work particularly well, and the farmers were the first probably to become disgruntled, because you had a farmer who came home. Not only was he farming his own land, he was farming his neighbour's land and the neighbour after that for a basic labourer's wage. So not very good money. He was then having to buy his own potatoes back from the government at quite an inflated price. So that didn't last long. And all of the tradesmen started reopening their businesses. And it failed. So ultimately, they had to go back to another system.
That's Britain's experiment with communism. That's fascinating, isn't it? In conclusion, really, I mean, so Neame, as you say, he was working with the British government. He managed to get that £1 million written off. It sounds like he was the right man at the right time.
He was, yeah. Very, very lucky to have him here. I mean, a massive workload that he faced. Another interesting document we've got here was a works programme which plotted all of the jobs that they had to do, which obviously you can imagine him poring over this. This is the copy we still have in Government House, so this is probably something that he looked at every day. So one of them here, rehabilitate 14 states houses at the Forest, calculated 7,500 man hours, and they allocated 14 prisoners of war to do it. So he was really burning the candle here. But a man of great energy, and yet somehow in amongst all of this, age 60, he became a father again. And Lady Neame, Bertha, gave birth to twin boys while they were living in the house. And we've got a picture of them here. This is a lovely group picture which has got the twins here. I'm not sure which one is which, but that's Nigel. Well, one of them is Nigel and one of them is Philip Jr. They were born while they were here, and they maintained contact with Government House. In fact, it was them and their families who presented the lovely portraits of the General and Lady Neame. So, a man of considerable energy.
And when he left in, was it 1953? Is he well remembered today? Do you think it was a successful period?
I think it's regarded as quite an achievement, as a successful tenure while he was here. I think that probably the bailiff, Ambrose Chervil, as well, who is remembered with a lot of affection. Neame actually returned to his home, his native home of Kent, where he'd originated from. In fact, in this picture, he's hosting a visit by the Duchess of Kent, which is a happy coincidence. So he went back there. The family is part of the Shepherd Neame brewing dynasty, which lives on today with beers like Spitfire and stuff like that. So I think Guernsey was very pleased to have had him here leading them.
And Guernsey bounced back. The island bounced back.
Yeah. I think it was hard. Certainly, my mother remembers food being in very short supply, food being rationed. But Guernsey people were resilient and resourceful. This was a Guernsey that was quite self-sufficient.
Well, it's a golden age there now, frankly. Whenever I'm there, I have a great time. So very, very sad to be missing this Liberation Day. But Marco, this was a great substitute. So thank you for showing me around that wonderful house and telling me the extraordinary story of its wartime experience, which kind of mirrors the wartime and reconstruction experience of the island and the people themselves.
You're welcome, Dan. Thank you for calling.